So I'm a big HubSpot user. Every startup that I work with end up having either HubSpot, migrating to HubSpot, migrating off HubSpot, but I always have to use HubSpot in some way, shape, or form. If you remember, I made an HubSpot admin script and like a GitHub repo for Scales a while back. These are great, and I still use them continuously. But the new HubSpot MCP server and the whole general developer experience that has happened in the past, let's say 6 to 12 months, has been really tremendous. And this video is meant to showcase the HubSpot MCP as an example, but more than that, it's meant to show the other stuff that we can do with HubSpot. And having administrated HubSpot for many years, I actually didn't know about some of the facts that I released recently, just kind of stuck in my own ways. And I felt like this video is a relatively good way of exploring that for myself as well. So thank you for watching, and let's dive into it. So I think a good start would be, hey, we have two different HubSpot MCP servers in practice. There's what they call the HubSpot MCP server remote and what they call the developer MCP server local. The developer MCP server local is mostly for developers working on the HubSpot CMS and app system. Of course, it doesn't load now, but it's not really meant for people who want to work on the CRM data side of things. It's meant for people developing applications and working on CMS content. So if you're working on that side of the platform, and we will have a full dedicated tutorial for that later on in the channel, you should use that server, which runs locally. You don't need a hosted instance. They have another server, which is the one we're going to focus on today, which is the HubSpot MCP server remote. That HubSpot MCP server is the actual MCP server you're used to from other platforms. If you use the Higgsfield MCP or the Moblin MCP, we've talked about both in the channel, that's a remote MCP you use on their platform that they host on mcp.hubspot.com. Now, I've actually talked about this HubSpot MCP server in my HubSpot admin skills video, but at the time, the tools or scopes that this MCP could use were not right. They will only read. So you can only do read-only activities with the server, and that bugged me to no end. So I basically chose to work directly with a personal app, what is known as the legacy apps. We'll talk about that too in the different items that you currently have in HubSpot later on. But I chose to use a key that directly calls the HubSpot API and does things. Now we can use the MCP to do a lot of that work for us in a much more let's say, convenient way. I'm considering updating the HubSpot admin skills repository to the HubSpot MCP server, so you can have a choice. Either you work with the API or you work with the MCP. However, the MCP does not support the creation of workflows and the editing of workflows, which the HubSpot admin thing that I built does. So we're not going to use it for everything, but I did thought about incorporating it. Anyhow, what happened recently was that they added this tool called Manage CRM Objects. I wasn't made aware of that. I didn't see an update. I didn't see a changelog entry telling me about this. I don't even know if there is something here that is a proper changelog for that. And if there is, I haven't seen one. Like, it wasn't clear to me that this changed, and if I can immediately find it, that it doesn't exist from my perspective. So they now have right inside of the HubSpot MCP server, which we didn't have before, which is very cool because most of the work that I do is with normal generic CRM objects. So contacts, deals, and everything on that side of the fence. So now we can create, update, but not delete. So we can shoot ourselves in the foot, and we can always roll back any CRM record in our instance, which is very cool. Before we dive into HubSpot MCP server and how it works and how we can use it in practice, I want to spend a moment talking about all the other options that exist regarding usage of the HubSpot, let's say, agentic or developer-first experience. I want to mention that one of the things that I'm actually building on the side right now, because I only thought about it while recording, is a thing that tracks the changes of the MCP servers in an open endpoint, in an open web page. So we can just, whenever, like, I'll just follow and track the MCP tool directory to see when new tools and new things come out. But before we do that, I want to talk about generally all the different options that you have for working in a developer-first way with your HubSpot CRM data. Let's go into that. So let's talk a little bit about the possible options that you have for development before we dive into the MCP itself. So the HubSpot CLI, which is the thing that pops out at you when you click the development button. By the way, if it doesn't show up for you, this is a test account, and it is automatically on the sidebar. If it doesn't, there's a more button here. You click it, it puts you into developers. Their HubSpot development flow historically was for people building on the platform, not in the platform. In other words, they're building CMS stuff, they're building apps, stuff like that. So a lot of the developer experience in HubSpot is geared around building stuff for complicated instances, or for dedicated apps for HubSpot on the CMS pages and the like. This is not what we're focusing on. And if that's what you want to do, you should definitely go around and look at projects, because projects is a new thing relatively, where you can essentially create an environment for your project, which is it does what it says on the tin. I think that the best way to look at it is, beforehand we had like source control and proper development functionalities that lived outside of HubSpot. HubSpot is really trying to move to be developer first, and that's their motion of like, let's build right inside the platform and align your actual code with whatever's happening on the platform, not focusing on that. The thing that most people know is legacy apps. Legacy apps is where you would build a private app on top of HubSpot. And they actually tell you, when you create a private account for one account, you should now use service keys. What happens with private apps is it is a scoped access mechanism to HubSpot that before service keys, we didn't have any other option for. So you create a legacy app, you get an app token, and with that token and the scopes that it allows, you can then access anything in your CRM data, workflows, campaigns, marketing automation, a lot of basically anything the REST API supports, if I remember correctly, if it's on a subscription level that you're allowed to access it, you would be able to access it via a legacy app. Now, we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to use service keys, which is this new thing that you can use in order to have the same experience that you have with legacy apps, but with a proper API key. So a service key is just an API key. That's how you should think about it. You can choose specific scopes for it, and then you can add any scope that you have in the API, you can have it here. Some of the scopes are blocked because I don't have access to it. Well, actually, this is a test environment and not my actual instance. I usually, in most of my startup customers, we are either on professional, sometimes on enterprise, but usually on professional, and in professional, on marketing professional. Some of the scopes do not apply. A developer test account is actually an enterprise instance, which means everything is available. So you can just use that. And then once I created the service key and gave it a name, I can see stuff being created with it. Let's look at an example. I created a new contact called my MCP demo, which actually was not created using the MCP. It was created using a service key, though that mistake on my end. But the general idea is when you do create a service key contact and start updating it, the activities pane will say that it was created from a specific service key. Now, this is a name you can change. So beforehand, we had offline sources with integrations like Airtable or whatnot that just chose random name and integration ID numbers that sucked. Now, instead, we can actually name our keys, and we can just name it. For example, if we gave it to, I don't know, our field manager's Claude, we can say Megan's Claude, and that is the name of the service key. So we will always know where it comes from, which is a very useful thing to do. Also, you can do anything with it, and it's automatically tracked in the audit log activity system inside of HubSpot. So everything that I do with the service key, I don't have any activities here because I just created it and moved it to a lead, will be automatically dialed in here, which is a very good way of like originally working with the keys. If you name them correctly, you can easily identify, even with offline sources or an integration, exactly where the keys came from. So that's a very useful thing. We also have MCP Auth Apps, which is the HubSpot MCP, which we'll talk about in a moment. We have the design manager, which we're not going to talk about because it's more like the file system. And then within keys, we actually do have two other types of keys. So a developer API keys is not used for working with the CRM that we work with. It's not meant for CRM data. It's meant for working with the actual HubSpot instance you work on. So therefore, you should probably not do it unless you know what you're doing and you're building HubSpot applications or stuff for the CMS. The personal access key, which conceptually seems like it would be very useful for the CRM data, in practice, it is not really meant for changing anything on the CRM object data. So you can't actually change anything. If you look at the type of the scope, it says you can read data from HubSpot objects, but you cannot create, delete, or make changes to those CRM objects, which in practice makes the service keys make much more sense, because in them you can use read and write, and not only read. And also, I think that, and again, I don't actually have any specific insights into how the HubSpot team thinks. Berry, which was on the channel recently, we actually haven't talked about that. Maybe we should bring him on for another interview and talk about that. But you can't really actively use a personal access key in the same way you use a service key. And I think the split is intentional. So a personal access key is I am using the platform as Tom doing stuff in HubSpot. And then service keys is probably more for automations and integrations and bots and AI. At least that's how I think it's set up, and that's what you should use. However, coming back to the MCP itself also is pretty darn capable. So let's take a look for a moment on what MCP Auth Apps are and how the MCP looks like. So in order to work with the MCP, you need to create an MCP Auth app, which is just an authentication layer for you to access the MCP server. When I go into the MCP Auth app, which I already created, you will see you'll have an app ID, a client ID. They will ask you to add a redirect URL. I created a new Netlify URL so we can actually use the MCP Auth. I think, and I haven't tried it yet, but I think that if you put a redirect URL that is not on an actual server, but is locally, even with ngrok or stuff like that, it will fail over time. I think that the reason for that is because they're trying to help you set up a more organized, auditable MCP experience for your team. So this MCP Auth app is not meant just for you. It's meant for anyone who has access to HubSpot and want to access the HubSpot MCP. So an MCP Auth app is not a single user-first thing. It is a global instance thing that multiple users can sign into, which why the redirect URL should be something secure and not this fakakta thing that I made here. But for the sake of the example, this is what we're going to do. And I think the final thing is actually to show you how the MCP looks like. So give me a moment and I'll spin up an instance to show you a test. But when you attempt to actually connect, in this case, I connected my Claude or attempted to connect my Claude instance over to HubSpot, you will basically get this screen, which is built by the MCP Auth app, which we just created. I'm going to select all. It's a developer test account. I don't care. And then I'm going to connect app. And then what it's going to do is it is going to allow it and tell me, hey, you are connected and all is good. Let's open Claude and see where it's at. So after we authenticated, if I look at the plugin and the connector, sorry, I have my HubSpot connector connected here. So first, I'm going to tell it, use the HubSpot MCP to list all my contacts in the CRM. Let's see where it gives back. Remember, it has a get contacts tool, so it shouldn't be hard to do. Search CRM objects, coming back. This is Haiku 4.5, which is pretty fast. This is all my contacts is like, less than 5-6 seconds. Pretty cool. And now, remember, I want to delete the contact. You shouldn't allow me because the MCP doesn't have access. Please delete my MCP demo. When I tried it from Cloud Code earlier, it did try and it did exactly this. It tried to forbid me from doing it, and then it understood that it doesn't have that, which is fine. The MetaCRM object doesn't have delete. It has create, edit, or read. So I'm going to tell it, please duplicate the my contact into a new contact, and then list all the contacts. The beautiful thing is, because of the MCP, while using a fast model like Haiku, I'm going to allow it to always use, just to skip the line. It moves very fast, and then I can do a lot of small, quick operations through HubSpot. This is a small database, but even with a big database, the way their search works is kind of like it does on the UI. It's very, very fast. So you can work on a lot of data very quickly and move fast while doing a lot of stuff in a auditable way. And then I can just tell it I want to change the name of my copy to my copy 2, 3, whatever, and then it's going to change and it just works. I just want to prove to you that it's actually connected and works with the actual instance you just saw, which is pretty cool. And that's it. We're done. The last thing I want to show you before I let you go is I don't know exactly when HubSpot is going to change their update mechanism so we can hear about the MCPs, but I'm building a small tool here. It's now on my Moda URL, but I'm going to move it soon. It's going to redirect through another more friendly URL, which will be at the description. I basically monitor the tools coming back from the MCP once an hour. And then when there's a change, there will be a little alert at the top where you can see what change was actually made. Now, I'm also going to add a little prompt for your agent to be able to monitor this. This is like a small little tool for me to follow up on the MCP just so I know what's up. I also consider adding a webhook so you know when the thing is updated and you can update your skills, but I don't really want to do it right now, mainly because I feel like the moment I release this and maybe send it to some HubSpot people, they're just going to point me at where the updates are happening all the time and change the documentation, because the documentation is indeed superb. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so far.